Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of the Star Trek Reboot films. This review is for Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness, and this review does contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen both of these movies, you may not want to watch this review until such a time as you have, otherwise things may be spoiled for you. So, I want to start this review in a bit of a long-winded way by telling you about my personal experience with Star Trek and how I got into Star Trek. Growing up as a little kid in the 80s, I always thought of Star Trek as a really boring and really nerdy thing. My mother used to tape record reruns of the original series and watch them, and I used to make fun of her for doing so. I remember seeing Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home in theaters when it first came out when I was 7 years old, and I enjoyed it the way I would enjoy any comedy of that era, but I still didn't think very highly of Star Trek. It wasn't until I was 12 when one night my brother decided to watch Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and I thought, oh, what the hell, I might as well watch it. Although I had seen bits and pieces of it before, and I was told by my parents that they took me to the theater to see it when it first came out, but I was 3 years old, so of course I didn't remember that. So anyway, this was the first time I actually sat down and watched the whole thing from start to finish, and I loved it. I was totally blown away. So then I watched Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, and I was totally blown away by that as well. So then I started watching all the Star Trek movies, there were 5 at the time, again and again. And then eventually I started watching reruns of the original series and started getting into that. And then Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country came out, and I was first in line to see that. And after that movie came out, I started really getting into Star Trek: The Next Generation. And this was while its 5th season was airing. Well, by the time the 6th season came out, I was a full-blown Trekkie that had seen every episode and every movie dozens of times. Shortly after, Deep Space Nine came out, and that had me hooked as well. And several years later, Voyager was released, and I was also hooked on that as well. I did lose a bit of interest in the Deep Space Nine Voyager years, but when Deep Space Nine started finishing up its final 2 seasons with the Dominion War story arc, I got right back into Trek and caught up on everything I had missed. So by the time Voyager had finished, I was waiting and wondering what the next Star Trek series was going to be. I was betting it would be something good, and then I remember it clearly. It was one of the great moments of disappointment in my life when they announced the next Star Trek series would be a prequel set 100 years before the original series. That didn't sound good at all, but I still thought I'd reserve judgment until I actually saw it because it was Star Trek, so surely it would be good. And then when I saw it, it was even worse than I expected and failed to meet my low expectations. But I stuck with it to see if it would get any better, and eventually it did in its 3rd season. But then it was canceled after its 4th season, and I can certainly see why. Although it got better, it was still held back by its boring premise, cast of cliche cardboard characters. So it was obvious to me that Enterprise had killed Star Trek, and the producers had totally lost touch with what the viewership wanted and what made Star Trek interesting to watch. So after the years Enterprise was canceled, I was in a Star Trek purgatory where we weren't quite sure if Star Trek was coming back at all or how long it would be. And during this time, I picked myself up a copy of Star Trek First Contact Special Edition on DVD and watched the audio commentary by writers Ronald D. Moore and Bernard Braga. In it, they talked about what would happen to the Star Trek franchise in the future. Both of them decided that the best thing to do would be just to erase the whole history and start from scratch again, like some comic book franchises like DC Comics had done before. And I was absolutely outraged when I heard this. This was the dumbest thing I have ever heard. One of the things that made Star Trek so beloved by fans was its rich history and lore that it had created. It had created a whole universe of different aliens, political situations, and beloved characters, and with histories fans explored through books, encyclopedias, and other sources, and they wanted to learn more about this rich world. But instead, these two douchebags, and yes, I called Ronald D. Moore a douchebag, and I'm not taking that back. Even though I love Battlestar Galactica, that comment can clearly only be uttered by a douchebag. Anyway, these two douchebags were suggesting to do the exact opposite of what they should have been doing since the Voyager days, enhancing the deep history and lore of Star Trek and exploring it more rather than running away from it. As fans demonstrated at every turn that that's when they were most interested in the series. And the many novels and fan material clearly demonstrated a yearning to learn more about this rich universe they created instead of completely wiping it all out and starting from scratch. And so I asked myself, would I even want to watch something that did that? And the answer inevitably was no, because if they erased everything that made Star Trek Star Trek, they'd also erase my interest and investment in Star Trek as a franchise. This statement just demonstrated to me how out of touch the higher-ups in charge of Star Trek were with its own fan base. I'm sure their thinking was that they needed to appeal more to the general public rather than the small fan base, and quite frankly, it was this kind of thinking that destroyed the franchise in the first place. If you first appeal to the base and make material that's really good, you'll attract the general public that way. By alienating your fan base and trying to appeal directly to the general public won't accomplish anything. Well, in most cases anyway. So then we flash forward to 2008 when I heard J.J. Abrams was directing a new Star Trek movie that was set when Kirk and Spock were teenagers at the Academy, in which they would use different actors to play them. This wasn't the ideal setting in my mind, but I was intrigued because I was a huge fan of Lost, a show that Abrams produced, and many of that team that worked on that show would also work in the new Star Trek movie with him. And since the current runners of the Star Trek franchise had grown so out of touch, I thought it was time that they give the reins of Star Trek to someone else. But as the release date of that film grew closer, there came ramblings that seemed to resemble what Moore and Braga were talking about in the audio commentary, that this new film would erase all we know of Star Trek by creating an alternate timeline. So ultimately, what we're looking at was a reboot. So I wasn't entirely dismissive at first. I thought, well, if they can pull it off well and stay true to what makes Star Trek, it'll be fine. So then finally, the film came out and I went to see it, and this is what I saw. This! You know, it even had that catchy little ringtone that Nokia phones have in present times. And, you know, that wasn't all. I also saw Kirk acting like a promiscuous member of a bike gang, Spock and Uhura in a relationship, Kirk and Spock trading places as captain and first officer like it was musical chairs. You know, and Romulans that looked nothing like Romulans, Vulcan getting destroyed, Starfleet's entire fleet of ships instantaneously getting wiped out by one ship, Kirk going straight from being a cadet to being the captain of a starship, and an overall future that lacked anything that resembled the universe we were presented in Star Trek. So, out of all these things, there's two in particular I have to touch on in more detail, as I think they are a big deal. First of all is the product placement. Now, I know some people are going to be like, yeah, I know that's dumb, but that's just a minor little detail. No reason to make a huge deal out of it. No! It is a huge fucking deal. And the thing is, I'm typically not one to complain about product placement. In fact, I think in most cases people make a bigger deal out of product placement than they need to. I'm looking right at you, CinemaSins. But that's in contemporary films set in present times, because product placement in such films can actually serve to enhance the realism of a scene. Nothing takes me out of a scene more than when there's some fake product, like someone drinking a can of Spiffies at Pizza Shack. Brand names and products are a normal part of life in Western culture, so to leave it out seems really weird and a bit off, and to, you know, put put these brand names in adds realism and makes the film seem more real and relatable. But there is such a thing as overdoing it when the product placement seems out of place in an obvious attempt at promoting the product. And to say the product placement in this film is out of place is a vast understatement. Not only is it out of place, it is directly contrary to the very essence of Star Trek, where humans have moved beyond the petty commercialism culture that now exists. And in point of fact, many aspects of this film, not just this one, completely spat on Roddenberry's vision of the future that Star Trek presented, as Starfleet officers acted more like modern-day military men getting into bar fights with locals for no reason, and Kirk was a motorcycle-riding rebel, and the fact that they even have cars and motorcycles in the first place is completely out of place. Seriously, I'm sure the moment that product placement was put on screen, Gene Roddenberry was spinning in his grave. This is an affront to everything that makes Star Trek Star Trek. The other major outrage is the fact that at the end of the film, Kirk goes straight from being a cadet to being a captain of a starship. And this is made worse in the next film when Captain Pike reprimands Kirk by telling him he's being sent back to school. This not only doesn't make sense in the Star Trek universe, it doesn't make sense in the real world. Someone isn't given command of a nuclear submarine right after they graduate from the Naval Academy. So again, this isn't some minor nitpicking complaint. This is a huge fucking deal that completely destroys the logic of this film. Not that it's the only mistake. Both these films are littered with unrealistic nonsense that makes these films come off as more of a satire or a children's movie where the normal laws of reality don't apply. And if you say Star Trek has always been like that, then you don't understand Star Trek either. Star Trek has always used questionable pseudoscience that's true, and at times unrealistic things happen, but it is always follows its own logic and the laws of reality it established. These films have no established reality and just create whatever reality is relevant to the plot line at the time. In short, these films are not Star Trek. They're not altogether bad films and are both entertaining space action summer blockbuster flicks, but they certainly are not Star Trek. I think of these films the same way I would think of a cover band doing covers of one of my favorite bands, especially a band that's no longer together. It might be great to hear the songs that you love and are familiar with since the original band is no longer together, but you know they are not that band and are just an imitation that could never be as good. In fact, I think these films would have worked better had they been presented as an original independent sci-fi action films. Unfortunately, Star Trek fell victim to this phenomenon that has affected Hollywood recently, where they like to ride off the coattails of established brand names rather than create original material. In other words, they choose to remake, reboot, and add sequels to already existing and well-established franchises that have been proven to make money. In other words, the reason these films bear the name Star Trek is all about the almighty dollar. It all has to do with money, because these films are likely to earn more money if it bears the name of an established title rather than an original one. And the characters are called Kirk and Spock even though they bear very little resemblance to the established characters that everyone knows as Kirk and Spock. And the universe presented in these films bears very little resemblance to the universe established in Star Trek. Yet it uses a lot of the same concepts like warp speed, transporters, Klingons, Romulans, and whatnot, but they're all totally different and not the same thing. So again, it's like a cover band. And shows like Enterprise, even considering how bad that was, it was still Star Trek. These films are definitely not Star Trek, and instead the name Star Trek is being stolen and used by greedy studios in order to make an easy buck. However, these films did succeed commercially and even managed to woo critics. However, it also manages to alienate every actual fan of Star Trek. I don't know of any actual fans, and not just a casual fan, but an actual fan that really liked these films. Abrams admitted he knew very little of Star Trek and thought it would be a more successful franchise if it was more like Star Wars. So fans' common complaint is that this film attempts to make a Star Wars film using characters and situations from Star Trek. This is why I think Abrams might actually do a good job with Star Wars, because that seems to be what he's more suited for, since he tried to make Star Trek into Star Wars. However, he is not well suited for Star Trek, and what he essentially managed to do is take a big old dump on Roddenberry's legacy that has been in development for over 40 years. The whole concept of a reboot should be a last-minute measure reserved for franchises that sucked or have aspects that need to be erased. Reboots have become so commonplace they just do them all willy-nilly because the writers are too lazy to research and expand upon the source material that's already there. Just like Terminator Genesis that dares to erase the events of the only beloved movies in the Terminator franchise, and shows like Fringe that erased the great first 3 seasons of the show that fans loved. Rebooting beloved material is a horrible, horrible idea and should be reserved only for erasing material that sucked in the first place. Like the way X-Men Days of Future Past erased the events of X-Men 3, which was a giant piece of crap that destroyed that franchise. That was actually one of the best things about that film. A reboot I'd like to see is the Alien versus Predator films, because there are comics and novels out there that prove that story can be done properly, but the films were total crap in the first place. So I would love nothing more than to just pretend those films never happened and see a reboot of better versions of that story. And I know this film tries to excuse it by saying that what we see in these films is a parallel universe and that the established Trek lore still exists in another universe, but that's just a lame technicality they try to use to say they're not really erasing all Trek we know and love, but essentially they are. And ironically, since this takes place after Enterprise, the one show that did destroy the franchise, it's the only thing they didn't erase. They erased the original series, all the Trek movies, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, that's all erased, but Enterprise, that's still intact, so way to go there. Anyway, these films aren't all that bad. I learned that if I shut down the logical part of my brain and just think of these as mindless blockbusters, I can actually enjoy them. So let me get more into specifics of each film, starting with Star Trek 2009. This film certainly has its moments, such as the very effective intro where Kirk's father sacrifices himself to save his crew, including his wife who was giving birth to Jim Kirk. And some of the action sequences were very effective, as was the introduction of Scotty as comic relief, and overall it's a suspenseful story that manages to hold your interest throughout the film, and it really gets you to feel for the tragedy Spock goes through when his homeworld is destroyed, and the camaraderie between Kirk and Spock works well at times. But overall, the film doesn't do a very good job at telling a single coherent story, and at times is just all over the place. A lot of the action scenes are just too much like a lot of modern day action films. It overwhelms the senses a bit too much, which actually hinders telling an effective story. And it's just all over the place with the story. For example, Kirk and Spock constantly switching places on who's captain and who's first officer was a bit jarring and not really relevant to the overall story. Plus, let's talk about Nero, the main villain. He reminded me a lot of Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in Mission Impossible 3, which was also directed by Abrams, in so much that they get a great actor to play the main villain, but made that villain really flat and two-dimensional. A good villain is one who is dynamic, you can actually identify with. Nero was just the stereotypical crazy villain who would just be like, "Oh, hi, how's it going? Could you lower your shields or I'll destroy your ship? Okay, thanks." And then he would just go crazy for no real reason, just kill someone out of the blue and chase it, I want Spock dead, and act all like evil. So anyway, I really got the feeling that Abrams was incapable of creating good villains for films, as they both had potentially, good villains with great actors behind them, but he squandered what could have been great. And there was also pointless scenes in this film that were just thrown in to look cool, like the scene when Kirk was on the planet running from the monsters, which reminded me a lot of the Jeep chase scene from Star Trek Nemesis. It may not have been as cheesy, but it was just as pointless and just as obvious an attempt to have a cool-looking action scene. But, as I said, the film's still entertaining as far as mindless blockbuster action movies go, so my rating for Star Trek 2009 is a 5 average. So then there's Star Trek Into Darkness. When this film first came out, I barely noticed, because after the grave disappointment that was the first reboot film, I wasn't that interested in seeing the sequel to it. However, when an evening I was stuck in town with a couple of hours to waste, so I thought, what the hell, and I just went to the theaters and saw it. And I gotta say, it was far better than I thought it would be. A friend who saw the film told me it sucked, and many of the critics were saying that the first film was better, so I wasn't expecting much at all. But it actually ended up being much better than the first one. Although after seeing shit like Kirk go from cadet to captain in an instant in the first one, I came into this film not expecting any logical sense of continuity, which is one of the reasons why I think I enjoyed it more. For one thing, unlike the first one, this film had one continuous story that fit together well, without all the irrelevant digressions. And for another thing, the relationship between Kirk and Spock worked much better in this film. It was built up too nicely from the beginning, with Kirk saving Spock's life and Spock going behind his back to Starfleet, which resulted in his command being stripped away because Spock was, well, just being Spock. And that theme followed all the way throughout to the end, where Kirk sacrificed himself to save the Enterprise and Spock was having to be on the other end of things. It was a great story arc that was built up to nicely. But the main thing this film had that the first did not was a great villain. Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan was everything Nero wasn't. A rich, dynamic, fully developed character you could identify with. Not only that, but he was also much more formidable, being a person who possessed superior intellect and strength. And now's the time where I'm going to say something really controversial. Those Star Trek fans who were totally with everything I've been saying up to now, I'm probably going to lose you with what I'm about to say. But it's how I really feel, and I make a point of being honest on how I feel, so I'm just going to come right out and say it. Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan is far superior to Ricardo Montalban's Khan. I'm sorry, but it's true. I think in a lot of cases people get blinded by nostalgia, and just because something has become classic, they hype it up in their minds and make it something that's much more better than it actually is. Because let's face it, the cold hard facts here. Ricardo Montalban is not that great of an actor. Benedict Cumberbatch is an amazing Shakespearean trained actor. I would put Cumberbatch's acting on par with Patrick Stewart. And honestly, I was never a big fan of Khan in the first place. Overall, I think he's really overrated. He just has the virtue of being in the greatest Star Trek movie of all time. And don't get me wrong, he's not a bad villain. Hearing him go on about revenge was cool, but he's not that great either. However, here he was much more menacing than he was in The Wrath of Khan. In The Wrath of Khan, we're constantly told he has superior intellect and strength. In this film, we were shown he had superior intellect and strength. This film did a great job in turning this into like a cat and mouse game between Kirk and Khan. And the ending showdown between Khan and Spock was also spectacularly done. So I'm sorry, even though The Wrath of Khan is a far superior film to Into Darkness in almost every way, I have to admit that Cumberbatch makes the far superior villain. And in addition to Cumberbatch, you also get Peter Sweller, best known for RoboCop, playing the corrupt Starfleet admiral who's involved in Section 31. Setting aside all the obvious Wrath of Khan references, which I'll get into momentarily, they actually gave us a Deep Space Nine reference by including Section 31. That touched all my nerd spots in the right places. And the way it was executed and integrated into the plot was pulled off so well. So now, let's get into all the Star Trek II references, which were very obvious, such as Kirk pretty much taking on Spock's place from the Wrath of Khan and sacrificing himself in the same way Spock did, and having Spock yell, "Khan!" the same way Kirk did. Some people found this cheesy and obvious. Was it obvious? Yeah. Was it cheesy? Well, no more so than the rest of these ridiculous films. I appreciated that this film was settling into its position as a cover band and was paying homage to the original material that it was emulating. And it was a very interesting the way that they switched the roles around, so you do get a parallel universe feel to see how the events would have gone down had the roles been reversed. And just the way Spock was affected by Kirk's death and was overall out for revenge on Khan was so much more believable as a character arc than his character arc in the first film was. However, this film had its problems, and it still was not Star Trek. As I said, I kind of had to turn the logical part of my brain off for this film, as the universe presented in this film is a jumbled one that doesn't really make sense or have logic to it, such as the transporters being capable of transporting people across the galaxy, and McCoy finding a way to cure death. Although I find it funny that critics love to pick on the flaws on this film, but completely ignored the flaws in the first film, which were actually much more numerous and much worse, but whatever. It was just a better constructed story overall, but all in all, still just a cookie cutter summer blockbuster action flick. So my rating for Star Trek Into Darkness is a 7, very good. So, just to update for those who didn't agree with my decision to leave these two films off my top 10 Star Trek movies list, had I included them, Star Trek 2009 would have ranked higher than The Final Frontier and the motion picture, and Into Darkness would have ranked higher than both those films and Insurrection and First Contact. But I didn't include them on that list because these two movies are not Star Trek. So, they don't really deserve to be compared to those films any more than Star Wars or Serenity does. So that's it for my review of the Star Trek Reboot movies. Be sure to check out my channel for many other Star Trek Top 10s and Star Trek reviews. And make sure you subscribe to keep up with my future Star Trek videos. And thanks a lot for watching.